One of the most challenging things in the beginning as an artist is that often our work can appear muddy. This was definitely the case for me. I really aspired to create bright, vibrant, sort of cartoony, comic booky style work, and yet a lot of my attempts ended up being gray and mushy and brown, and I had a huge challenge just kind of getting out of that muddy, kind of brown color scheme. Now, since then, I have become a professional artist, and one of the things that I feel has really allowed me to get over that muddy kind of lack of contrast style of art is the understanding of warm and cool contrast. Now, I feel that as my career progressed, I actually got to understand this concept a lot better. And in the beginning, I wasn't always doing the best job of it. So what I want to do in this video is actually look at and share with you my journey, understanding the concepts of warm and cool and how it relates to coloring and color theory and creating really interesting illustrations. And I'll share with you some of my successes, some of my failures, and my key takeaways when it comes to mastering the concept of warm and cool in color theory. As usual, for Drawing Codex video, this is not going to be fast-paced, nor is it going to be heavily edited. This is a laid-back session. I'm just going to share with you some of my work that I've created over the decades, and we're going to talk about color theory, and more specifically, how I think you can avoid muddy, low-contrast problems with your images. So, think of it more like a drawing lesson. It's just going to be you and me hanging out, talking about color theory. Hopefully that sounds interesting. Hopefully you'll join me. Let's jump in and get started. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name is Tim McBurney. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel, we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. If you want to learn more about illustration or picture making, you can check out my free illustration mini workshop. This charts my journey, going from someone who really wasn't that good at drawing or art to becoming a professional artist, being published. I discuss topics such as how to get more detail and polish in your work, how to think about composition, creating thumbnails for your scenes, as well as a few ideas surrounding how to think about getting professional work. It's free and the link will be in the description, so if that's something you're interested in, go check it out. Alright, so I've got a bunch of different images here, and I'm just going to talk through a couple of things that really sort of helped me when it comes to understand this. And this is something where I kind of went on many journeys. So this is not a linear thing where I necessarily understood it perfectly in the beginning. I'll show you to begin with sort of an older image that I created. And you know, on this journey, I was really just trying to understand this basic concept to begin with. A lot of the style that I was looking at was making things more rendered, so adding shadows and highlights and sort of rendering the characters a little bit more. And you can see with this image that I just was having a big challenge, right? It was really hard for me to get the feeling of color vibrancy. I liked looking at art where, you know, there was a dominant color. You know, a lot of comic books in sort of the early 2000s had very strong, bright colors, and I kind of wanted that look. And you can see I'm sort of getting the general idea of color theory. I've got everything's kind of purple. I knew it was at night, but I didn't want to make everything black, right? So I'm using color to indicate, look, it's the night. I am also using some basic color theory, saying, hey, I've got these yellows as well. You can see this is sort of inside, but what I'm kind of really struggling to do is to actually differentiate the roofs of the houses, the walls of the houses, the characters. The characters different, like they just kind of all look sort of blue, right? And what I was essentially doing is just kind of working things up from that kind of purpley blue base. And then what I do, and this is often what I feel like happens when I'm sort of talking to students, is I just be trying to add more contrast because it wasn't having enough contrast. And I didn't have either a good sort of foreground, background value separation really going. So I'm not, even though I am a little bit, I'm not really pushing these back and sort of having foreground, middle ground, background separation, defining the shapes there. it's all just a bit sort of mushy. So I'd just be dialing up the contrast, trying to make it work. And even though it's kind of, it's not a bad image, I mean, I still think it's kind of a cool idea. It's sort of dynamic. It's got a lot of the things we might want from a cover, you know, lots of sort of dynamic triangular lines and things that work. But on a basic color theory level, I just wasn't understanding how to have, you know, for instance, the roofs could be red or dark, the trees should be green, but then we need to look at how those different colors are under the effect of, you know, night, and then again we want to push them into the background by sort of making them cooler. So there's a lot of basic color theory here that will really help in terms of pushing things away from us, making things less distinct in the background because that's not our primary read, and making those cooler versus having our primary characters, things we want in focus, to be warmer. So just understanding that would have helped me a lot here. So we'll look at some other images that sort of as I progressed, I got a lot better with this. If I just kind of go and sort of open up one here, you can see, again, this is like an image that I worked on quite a while ago, but you can see that I'm using a kind of a similar style here. I've been painting the background a little bit, and again, one of the things I also want to unpack is when I tried to change my style a little bit and deal more with flat color and say, like, can I create these backgrounds with line? Because I thought that would just take a little bit less time and you know, just have a more sort of comic booky look. This concept of warm and cool really sort of came up again, and I had to reassess a lot of these ideas. But you can see here I've got a much better sense of, like, yes, there is green in the background for grass. I still got this vague purpleness to a lot of like the castle and the dirt here, and look, it's not perfect, but I think it works a lot better. The foreground though is still kind of muddy, right? It has a very sort of gray tone, and I think often what was happening here was I was just a little bit tentative to really sort of push the shadows, push the color, you know, really sort of do anything and step on it. So, you know, I have some subtlety here, but there is a sense where a lot of this is quite sort of dark and muddy still, and I didn't have full control over that. So I managed to separate the background here quite well, but yeah, this is still something where I feel like my understanding of the temperature wasn't quite there. Now, as I sort of got better at using these ideas, again, this was sort of done at a similar time to, you know, when I was sort of creating my sort of comic book here. Go to this one, and you know, when I was sort of creating my Ara comic, I had like a pretty good general color scheme for the whole thing that I'd sort of worked on, and as I sort of progressed through the book, I got better at doing it. And this is really a good implementation of simple color scheme and simple implementation of warm and cool. I had a forest setting, and what I do is just sort of alter the temperature of a lot of the greens depending on whether I wanted to focus on a character, and in this case I wanted a lot of these characters to have focus on them. So you can see that, you know, here we've got, if I kind of just go into eyedropper land, select the background, you know, I've got this kind of muddy, yellowy, sort of green, right, for the sort of foliage that's on this character as part of his sort of cloak and clothing. And if we look just generally, I have good separation between the warm and cool sort of light and shadow. So if we look at the shadow for that same color, right, let's see if we can get a, right, let's get this one, boom, let's get the shadow there. Right, so you can see it's much cooler. So I've got good sort of shadow versus a light differentiation on a temperature level. And then I even was painting in super roughly, now look at it, a bit of an even sort of cooler green as a bit of that sort of reflected light. And again, this is not logical lighting, but it's just aiding with the contrast and where we want the viewer to look. Same thing on the character. So you can see here I've got the differential between the lit side of the form and the shadow side of the form, and there's a big sort of temperature differential there. So this is basic temperature color theory, and this is what I was starting to sort of understand as, you know, I sort of progressed through this. So this book was done, you know, probably 5 or 6 years after that sort of first purple image that I sort of showed you. And I think, yeah, it's easy to see. Also, I have, some of these sort of greens in the background. You can see they're even cooler, right? And again, some of these in the far background. So you can see there's a good sort of understanding of how that sort of progresses and how we would sort of use that simple theory. Same thing on here, right? I've essentially got warm highlights, right? So if we look at sort of the highlight of this guy, right, it's the blue, and then the shadow is, right, yeah. Yeah, so just sort of understanding the temperature changes between the warm and the cool sides, and also the foreground and the background. So greens in the foreground, right? Here I've got the grass in the foreground. Here I've got the blue in the background. And again, the background is getting cooler. And if we just sort of look at the general sort of the patterns that tend to evolve with using the characters on this background, we got a nice sort of bright version of the character skins, right? And in the background, whoa, right, got some sort of cool colors. So we're getting sort of natural, at a hue level, good separation. So, I feel like this book had a lot of that freshness, where I was able to kind of separate some of the characters, leave them, sort of open, right? Not make them too dark, but still get some good contrast there. All right, let's look at another page, see if we can kind of see basically the same thing. So same basic idea here, same project, slightly different vibe, but this is less fresh. I wanted this to be more like they're deep in the forest, so it's a lot darker. And you can see I've got the same basic theory going on here though, right? I've got some warmer greens for the highlights, some cooler greens for the shadows. And if you look at greens in the foreground versus greens in the background, I've got the same kind of thing. We're getting cooler. The colors are moving, right, on the slider. They're moving more towards the blue, so they're going to feel cooler. And they're also getting a little bit less saturated. So yeah, just simple color theory, and this allowed me to kind of push a lot of these greens in the foreground, make them feel very vibrant, even though, they're not sort of full saturation. And a big part of this also was, getting over this idea that, because again, I think when we're learning, so often what happens is that we get a little bit intimidated by the reality of it, right? So I'd be learning to create art, and I'd be learning about rendering and lighting and, what happens. And I think it's often important to learn all of that stuff and then sort of delaminate yourself from reality if you're creating stuff in a more comic booky style, and say, for instance here, I'm going to make this background really blue. If we sort of look at that background versus the stuff in the foreground, right, there's a big value change, and there's also a big sort of temperature change, right? All this stuff is still very vibrant, but it's very much sort of blue versus these colors, which are kind of green. And, just being able to sort of have the confidence to do that was something that I really lacked early on. So I didn't really know how to use the colors, so it's being tentative, and it was harder to make these kind of stronger color choices and color changes from, sort of foreground to background. But same thing here. I've got the difference between the light and the shadow. You can see here that there's a little bit less of a temperature shift, right? I've got, right, this is just a more sort of muddy version of it. And you can see that some of the rendering there feels a little bit more muddy, right? It doesn't have that sort of freshness that some of the others do. I think this is like an earlier page, and that other one I was showing you was a later page. So you can kind of see that, as I was progressing through this, here's like another example of how, I'd often be using rendering as a way to kind of create interest in the art, sort of lighting, and sort of trying to combine like painted backgrounds with anime style characters, mixing things up. I was always sort of experimenting with style. And if we look at the Pinocchio sort of book that I did, again, starting to have like a good sort of grasp of, again, how we're going to structure an image like this. Okay, I've got a sort of cool, dark nighttime, but this is a much more effective nighttime. And I've also done something that I think is really important, which is I've sort of thought ahead and said, what would be a dramatic way to kind of set this scene. So setting it at night, having the lanterns there, I'm like, okay, that's going to give me an opportunity, which is something that I didn't have here, right? So if you sort of look at this image, you know, I've got the same kind of idea, but it just doesn't have that amount of punch. It just sort of looks a little bit washed out, whereas this one has, you know, a little bit more focus, right? And I'm using the warm colors to really sort of draw our eye towards the main, you know, sort of focus of that image. And likewise here, I'm often just playing off these sort of cool gray backgrounds. I want this book to feel a bit older, you know, like sort of it is an older sort of Pinocchio story. I like the idea of, you know, having Pinocchio in these, you know, sort of somewhat like depressing, kind of more realistic environments, even though they're cartoony. But yeah, often we just have simple yellow, green color contrast for Pinocchio. He looked always sort of fresh and sort of popped off the background because that was always kind of working. And yeah, wherever I could, I just play up this sort of warm and cool. So you can see this is happening all the time, right? Making some of the characters features. Let's just make a boom. Yeah, just sort of looking at some of these features, and then we've got the shadows. So I got much better at just, you know, doing the basic stuff, right? Let's make sure the shadows are cool versus the highlights. Same as on Pinocchio, right? We got the shadows there. Boom. So we're changing, right, everything. A bit darker, a bit less saturated, a bit more towards the yellow. And yeah, wherever I could, let's try and design something that has a really interesting setting so that I can emphasize the warm and cool color contrast. That's a big part of it. I think probably something that I could have done on that sort of other illustration was really think about, okay, now that I've got, go here, right? Like now that I've got this idea of warm yellow openings to these buildings, could I arrange them in an interesting way to kind of help me pull focus? Like, could I put one behind the character or something? That's probably the kind of thing that I would do now, is to think about the color first, do the color thumbnail, see if I can kind of really, you know, think through it, and then sort of go through the process of creating it as opposed to just trying to color it. But still, when I came to try and move from this to more of a flat colored style, I was having like a fair bit of troubles. Here's a few sort of examples where I was trying to get things to look low-key, use flat color, and stepping away from being able to add those cooler shadows, to push and pull, you know, things was a real challenge. And I found that when I first started doing this, still, I feel like my ability to properly understand and utilize warm and cool wasn't as good as it could be. And this is because we're not dealing with those differences between shadow and highlight as much. We're dealing with just pure color. And again, I had to even go further and kind of say, how do I really just push contrast with pure color? And this was a good sort of way of me sort of growing as an artist and understanding that. But, you know, this was part of a series of little sort of testy images that I did. Some of them sort of worked better than others. And I think what I sort of noticed is that a lot of the ones that worked better, that I kind of liked and, you know, tended to have a little bit more impact, people, you know, more people liked them on Instagram, basically. Yeah, it was when I sort of understood this better. So here we have, again, very simple color scheme. If we kind of turn the color off on this one, it still kind of works from a value standpoint. But the way it's interesting is the vibrant Howard Pyle-esque yellows, ye old pirate illustration. But I think what I was able to do here was say, okay, let's separate the foreground and the background just based on color, and mostly based on color hue, right? So just making it more green, right? That allowed me to not have to push a lot of dark and a lot of contrast here. So I was starting to get the ability to create that color vibrancy without resorting to like really pushing the values, and just sort of looking at colors relative to each other. So the different wrinkle to the same idea of using sort of warm and cool. And I think some of these worked better than others. This was another example where just having warmer colors of the character's skin as a primary sort of focus helped. And this is the kind of stuff you need to start thinking about as, you know, you kind of begin making images. It's a lot easier to create an image if you kind of think about the general color scheme in the beginning, and the image will tend to have a little bit more impact. There was no more effort put into this image than the others, but I feel like it just felt a bit more sort of organized. Although I still do have a good, right here we've got some separation between the shadow and the highlight of the environment. So I was still doing that, but the character was kind of flat. But yeah, this took a lot of me sort of figuring this out. So if we sort of go then and look at some of the work that I was doing a little bit more recently, where's a good example? Right, again, here's a good example of trying to use, mostly sort of flat colors. I do have some little bit of rendering here, but what I've really been trying to do is say, okay, I want a style that's kind of flat color, it's got clean lines, and instead of trying to lean too much into value and make the things in the foreground really dark and the things in the midground become more sort of gray and toned out, adding atmospheric perspective, I'm trying to use color theory more, and specifically the ideas of warm and cool to separate the background from the foreground and still keep things kind of looking and feeling sort of vibrant. And a lot of this is just because it kind of prints better. It just kind of looks a little bit better. So it took me a long time to try and figure out how to use more color, be more egregious and sort of unrealistic with the way the color was used to get sort of different feelings. And I feel like, again, I really sort of like this image. I feel like it has a fresh sort of sci-fi look, and I feel like we can still read the foreground from the background, even though if we look at the value changes here, right, we've got, here's the foreground, right, here's the midground, and here's some of the blues in the background, and if we actually sort of look at the value differences, there's not that much value, right? We're looking at very small differences in value, just enough to separate sort of light from dark, but I'm really pushing the temperature change. So in this instance, right, if we then look at the midground, right, I've got midground here versus foreground. Again, very similar, but I'm just modifying the temperature, and this one is going to go even more blue. So again, super simple ideas, and this style is like brutalistly simple. It's just basic flat color, and this really pushed my general ability to understand sort of what makes an illustration work. Now, not every image that you do or I do has to have, strong, warm, cool contrasts, but this was an example of where I think just sort of being able to manage the subtler transitions helped me a lot. Again, I've got a good sense of sort of warmer yellows, cooler yellows, making sure I leave some room there. Adding, I've got a little bit of sort of green here to color contrast, and adding some, right, if we sort of look at, right, the different yellows we've got here. Let's get a bit of room so we can have a look. Right, got different sort of yellows, and then we got some in the background, and yeah, this sort of color temperature, even though it's a monochromatic image, is allowing me to really kind of push and create some separation. And I also, right, have a more desaturated sort of shadow inside some of these cloaks. So just like using very, very simple tools, modifying the colors in a very sort of subtle way. I'm mostly looking at, not making them too light or too dark relative to each other, but just looking at the relativity of temperature as it relates to the actual hue of the color. Right? Is it green? Is it blue? Is it redder? Is it more yellow? You can see these are all essentially yellows, but and oranges and stuff like that. But again, just being able to subtly change those has allowed me to create, a very simple image. It's all yellow, but still there's enough separation there that this one, right? Even though you could say from a theory, like this one is, still monotone, right? It feels like, to me, it has a little bit more vibrancy to this one. But again, let me know what you think. So again, that was like a little bit of my journey, right? Sort of understanding this, and a lot of it is just reassessing, relearning some of these fundamentals, recommitting to some of these fundamentals, and I'll show you a couple of sort of examples here. Some of these are tutorials that are on the Drawing Codex channel. You can sort of check it out. This is another example of where I'm still trying to do that same thing, which is create a cartoony image that's very toned down. And this is something I'm always kind of playing with. It's essentially one color, and that's normally something that, again, is not ideal to do with the line and color style, because you want to add and use the color. But what I'm always interested in doing is, trying to sort of push that, and the way I've done that is just to modify and play with the simple color temperature. So I've got some of these rocks in the foreground, right, are a lot more sort of red. Again, I've got grain over everything, which adds a little bit of color vibrancy as well, a bit of color vibration. But if you compare that to a lot of these colors in the background that are much more gray, you can see what I'm dealing with is just color temperature. And this is why temperature is so important. It's so much easier to understand whether an image is working or not based on temperature. Because if you just say, hey, I need to put more color in there, I need to make the background blue and cool. It's like, yeah, we don't need to make it blue, we just need to make it cooler. And we can do that through just reducing the temperature and the saturation. So again, this is another really sort of simple image, but it is the color vibration between these sort of grays, which are the cool colors, the sepia sort of orangey colors, and then having a few of these kind of red highlights, right? Like adding a few little bits and pieces here and there. And it's just that it's enough little vibration between those things that the image kind of feels like, yes, it's monotone. Yes, they're sort of walking through a sandstorm and it's all going to be sort of grayed out. But yeah, there's still enough there. This is another one of those ones where I feel like, and this is also something that's really important to understand is, you know, here I was kind of tackling this idea that I sort of did want to play around with the character being in this weird dystopian environment, right? There's a couple of times, often I just do this with an image, right? I just kind of think that's a fun setting. And I kind of knew going into this, again, this is another sort of tutorial. You can check out the whole sort of process from start to finish. But this is another example where I, you know, sort of really toned it down. And, you know, this is a very sort of monotone image. If you turn this one black and white, it's sort of barely there, right? It's a very sort of subtle image, but still, again, I think it has like a very distinct vibe. One of the other things you notice is the more that you lean into a line and color style, I've got these lines here, right? The lines will separate everything. And that really is a key to how you can utilize color, is to understand how it applies to your style. So it's a little bit harder for me to do this actually when I didn't have lines around everything. So if I sort of go back and compare this to, you know, sort of a different image here, this is another one that's sort of a mix of sort of characters that are rendered with a painted background. It's a little bit more important here for me to play up the color vibrancy and the interest. This is another image where it's kind of just all one color, but I've got this blue here. And even though it's not necessarily, again, I'm going opposite, the warm colors are going to come forward and sort of, you know, attack your eye. I've kind of got the background yellow, which is, again, something you shouldn't do. But it kind of works here because, you know, it's not necessarily an image where we're meant to sort of 100% focus on her. Plus, she's a character, so you're going to do that. She has very few clothes on. People are probably going to notice that as well. But most importantly, I have this blue here, which is just going to create that vibrancy. So everything's yellow, yet she's got these blue clothes on, and therefore we're kind of drawn to her, even though we're going opposite the way that the color theory should work. And again, this is where the more you learn about it, the more you can know, okay, am I going against the rules, right? Like, how does this work? But I think here I had to play a lot more with the color saturation. So I've got in the painted background, we got some warms for some of these shadows, and I've sort of gone really sort of red for some of them, right? And then I've got some much more desaturated grays in there. But this is, you know, an image where I had to kind of push the vibrancy, right? It's monotone. Let's push the color vibrancy, make a lot of saturation. You know, here, the only thing that's making this image survive is the fact that it's got black lines around everything. And so you can kind of read it, even if it's all just one color. So that's always something to remember. It's one of the things that lines give us a lot. So again, hopefully that gives you an idea for, you know, how things have sort of progressed and some of the challenges that I've sort of dealt with as it relates to this. I think as I sort of got better at using flat color, one of the things that I started to do was, again, draw more things that are going to be different colors in the scene. When we can paint things, it's a lot easier to make and create interest. So here, as an example, I'm sort of painting things. I've got color vibration. I can kind of make things interesting with texture, and there's always that opportunity to create visual interest that way. When you're dealing with flat color, let's go back to here, well, you don't have any of that, right? I've got some texture that I put in, but a lot of what we need to think about is, what are some things I can add as a drawing that I'm going to color one flat color or very simple gradient that are going to sort of create interest and visual complexity and sort of make the image, look interesting enough. So again, this is another example of where, as I sort of progressed, I sort of was able to use a lot of this color theory and, really sort of lean into it. But here you can see I've got a lot of this foreground stuff. Again, it's warm, it's coming forward, and a lot of this stuff in the background. Right, if we sort of color pick this, boom, boom, stuff in the background, sort of all these grays. And yeah, just that sort of color contrast and vibrancy is all we need. It all seems like it even though it's quite colorful, it doesn't seem like everything's vastly different color, and still feels like, again, I wanted it to feel as if, it's kind of a workshop, it's a sort of laboratory, there's a bunch of junk everywhere. So yeah, I sort of got a lot better at utilizing some of these tools with that flat color style. So just quickly before I sort of move on to the next thing I was going to talk about, yeah, the thing I was kind of getting at here is, if you know that you are going to create an image that doesn't inherently have any sort of interesting color scheme there, it's just kind of sort of muddiness, right? That's what this image kind of is. I still have some color temperature separation between the background and the foreground, and I've tried to make some of these sort of rocks in the foreground have this, sort of bright undercarriage, and I've got, some brightness to the character's cape, right? There is some sense of that, but fundamentally you have to go into it knowing that that is kind of what's going to happen to it. And as long as you lean into that, I think it's going to be okay. It's often a challenge when we do that, but then it's not quite working, and so as a result we kind of, again, keep trying to sort of dial up the contrast there. So I'll show you a couple of examples where I feel like the color was working a little bit better in terms of style, and I'll sort of show you how I'm often sort of pushing some of these ideas. So here we've got a pretty sort of strong image. I've got predominantly red. This is going to be very kind of striking, and I'm using simple grays as a counterpoint to that. So here, if we have a look at the character Moda's skin, it's pretty bright, right? I've got some serious red here. But, down here, I've sort of toned it down a bit. It's going to feel a little bit cooler just because it's darker. And if we look at the grays here, right, I'm actually on the blue. So there's quite a lot of actual color contrast here. I'm not just pushing these towards the, towards the gray. I'm actually pushing all the way into the blue territory. These are actual kind of blue grays. And yeah, so very, very strong color usage. And also what you'll notice is, again, this is not always a matter of, again, like the general rule is warm colors are going to come forward, but the most important thing above everything is just that temperature change, warm and cool contrast will draw the eye. So I've got the ship here, I've got bright blue engine trail, and that is going to really sort of draw the eye because it's such a contrast to what's behind it. And again, it took me a long time to sort of transition from being kind of stuck here where I'm like, oh, okay, everything's kind of one color. I'm always sort of grading things down. And, certainly being sort of stuck here where I feel like, look, this is kind of working, but yeah, it's not having that sort of color vibrancy. So it took me a long time to sort of get to the point where I'd be like, okay, no, we're going to have a bright red alien, and then I'm going to have the, sort of engine trail coming from the ship, and it's going to be absolutely bright blue, and sort of figuring out how to do that. A lot of this comes down to understanding as we're drawing, like what element is going to be what color. But if we sort of take the color out of this image, you see it really isn't in any way, shape, or form as interesting. So yeah, that's sort of something that's important to note. Here I've got, again, a couple of images that are still going against that general rule, and this is what I always want to throw in, is just talking about fundamental rules like warm colors come forward, cool colors recede. These are just sort of general guidelines. Here I've got a good contrast because the character is cooler. I got a blue, and because it's such a simple image, having some of this vibrancy between the yellow smoke and the sort of cooler background just makes it a very, very simple, basic image with a character. And because the color is not too overwhelming, we are just sort of drawn to the character's face. So again, this is all a matter of just understanding, how do you entertain the eye? How do you draw the eye? What are the tools that are going to do that? A face is always going to do the job, especially if it's smack bang in the middle of the page. But yeah, you can see here where, you know, I'm really blatantly leaning into a lot of these simple color theory ideas. You know, I've got the red character in the foreground. She's not red, right? She's not meant to be those colors at all. The character in the background is not meant to be blue. But, you know, I'm just like, I think it'll look cool, right? Let's just do that. And I feel like it was that stuff that I would see in a lot of, you know, the sort of classic, you know, French bande dessinée, the classic comics. Also a lot of, you know, manga and the way people would just color stuff where they just really lean into these abstract colors. And it took me a long time to get there, basically. But a lot of it was just understanding this basic color theory of temperature and how we can really sort of ramp it up to get different effects. And yeah, also just having the confidence to lean into pure color theory. Anyway, let's quickly jump over to the drawing table and I'll show you some actual books and just sort of in a similar way, just sort of step you through how my understanding of this changed as I was creating different comics. All right, here we go. So The Seven Pirates was the first book that I did, and I think this was a real challenge because in general it kind of had a ye-old sort of pirate vibe, and this was something I was trying to really sort out. But one of the biggest challenges I had, and this especially was, I think this was actually the first test page I did, this page here, and look, it was struggle town. You can see here I'm struggling with, similar to that first image I showed you, where I'm really struggling to think of a good way to sort of separate these things out. You can see all these things in the background are kind of the same temperature. I'm not really pushing any of these things into the background that much. The clouds are all very similar colors. Look, looking at this, I'm like, there's 5 or 10 ways I could think of to really kind of make the color better here and to kind of separate things. So I was trying, but one of the real struggles I had was just figuring out like how to get out of my own way and separate the foreground from the background using temperature. And so I kind of ended up over rendering, and I'd often be like kind of adding extra contrast and trying to push things, and I get feedback saying, we don't like it, it's kind of washed out, and you know, you know, I'd sort of try and keep pushing it, but I think a lot of this is not fully understanding, again, how I was going to get this to work. Was it through tonality? And this is where you get advice that's, you know, every image has to work if you sort of make it black and white. You know, it's one of the bits of advice you get all the time. Again, not always. That's not entirely true. And what I'd sort of find is that when I was able to use more color, right, I was able to actually, you know, sort of make it look a bit vibrant and sort of fresh. And, you know, this kind of, you know, quite a cool sort of page. When I sort of had to do these more pirate powdered wig pages, it was a real struggle. I just couldn't figure out how to make it look interesting. And I think what I would do now was just lean more into creating visual interest through the color. I think I could sort of easily do that now if I kind of had half a brain to do this. So yeah, again, simple concept, but what I just wasn't getting was how to sort of separate these different things out onto different planes. Again, this was penciled and then scanned in, so there's a technical limitation. It's hard to separate out different layers when you're doing that, but I certainly could have, you know, figured out many different ways to actually get that to happen. So I have some good, I feel like this page was one of the first pages that actually started to work. I had a good differential between the coolness of the things that were in shadow versus the sort of brighter elements that were in light. But, you know, still a lot of these pages just kind of looked gray, right? They looked muddy. And this was sort of very frustrating. Now, once we got out into the pirate town, right, just naturally the environment was doing it for me. And this is where often it's so important to understand this, is some settings are just going to be more visually interesting than others because they don't require any color theory to be like, bam, right? Like, look, this is cool. We sort of got the blue seas and the pirate look. We got the red sort of pirate sashes and, all these little bits and pieces. And I feel like here I was sort of starting to get a feel for like how to make it work. But yeah, then I'd sort of hit another one of these pages. And you can see here I really tried to make, put some blue in the background. But look, there's so many times where I could have just made that background cooler, right? And it just would have separated it right out. But I was essentially sort of afraid, right? I had fear adding too much color or sort of pushing it too much. I was just kind of trying to survive. So as a result, like, I think it's interesting, but what I would notice is when there would be a natural scene that would be more visually interesting, like again, pirates fighting, it would look more interesting. But I just couldn't figure out a way to make these sort of interior shots interesting. But you can see I started to get a feel for it. I started to just work, you guessed it, the simple warm and cool color contrast. I started to make the skin tones a little bit sort of brighter, and I started to make basically all the backgrounds a lot cooler. So you can see here I was really playing with that. I have some sort of very cool shadows, and I really started to lean into this idea of sort of emphasizing the coolness of the shadows, the warmth of the light, and this started to help a lot. But still, again, then I'd sort of deal with some of these pages, and this is almost exactly the same color scheme as that first image I sort of showed you, purpley blue, and I'm trying to make it look interesting by showing the inside. But again, I really didn't have any idea how to properly separate these things out and kind of make it work just with the color. So I'd be like, it's kind of going well, and then I'd do with this, and it just looked like a brown sort of page, right? Which is kind of okay. It kind of fit with the vibe, but yeah, look, it was just generally a struggle. And the number one takeaway I took from this was that having a more interesting setting, more interesting environment, led to a more interesting page, and that was something to really sort of pay attention to. But I think if I had more of a control over the color, I would have been able to figure out some way to make this interesting. Like, for instance, here we got this panel here, and this is, this guy getting beaten up. And he's getting beaten up just to show that he's not on the side of the Jacquard, the pirate captain. So he's kind of, he's a plant, but they beat him up just to sort of prove. So it's a pretty like rough idea, right? But I could have made this whole panel like just red, right? To be like, to just hammer home the story point and say like, look, how badass are these guys? But instead, I just kind of made it gray, because what color would it be outside? It would be gray, right? That's what was happening. And again, it's my inability to just say, what would be fun? How can we make this visually interesting? So here, again, I felt like this page really worked. Why? Blue background, right? Nice sort of red, pop of red. And that's just because this guy, he's had a red pirate captain's jacket, right? And So I think like the TLDR, the number one thing I would sort of take away from this was just that, I kind of was starting to learn, and as the pages progressed, right, as we got sort of on, right, as we get, I think like even like the last page, I feel like I sort of got this one to work pretty well. I avoided it making it look too muddy. And things looked a little bit more fresh. I kind of started to figure it out, but still, warm and cool was really, really helpful. And also just having the ability to create color vibrancy by, just using abstract colors. So here we can see, again, third sort of book that I really did. My art had improved a lot by this time. And just did a lot of very, very basic color theory stuff. So you can see, and I think I've talked about this particular cover on sort of other color theory sort of videos, but really simple color scheme. I've got yellow and blue. It's blue in the background. That recedes. This comes forward. I've got the nice foil. All kind of works, right? Good color plan. What that allowed me to do is not make the characters in the background dark, not have to make anything too light or dark. It still has that kind of bright, colorful feeling. It probably looks a little bit darker on the camera than it actually is. But leaning into the color. And you can see here what's happening is something that's not happening in all the others. Is all the characters are their right color. We've got the fox is yellow, orange. The blue-haired fairy has blue hair. Everything's kind of right. Everything's there. It's just pushed into the background. Super simple stuff. I mean, all you do in Photoshop is just get a big airbrush and just put it over there. Get some blue. Eyedrop that, right, and done. But yeah, I was having sort of trouble doing that. So yeah, I think that what I sort of got better at doing was this kind of color contrast where we had something more dramatic going, and I try and push the color contrast a little bit. You can see we're in the dark, and I'm really sort of saying, let's make this just blue. And then you have a good scenario where you've got some fire, and then I'm like, okay, let's make this really red, right? Let's lean into the abstract nature of it. This is another good example. I talk about this in a sort of previous color video as well. We got leaning in much more to, just sort of more abstract color spaces. Here, again, the same thing. Got this nice kind of yellow dreamscape, separating out the dream, separating out here, and then again, sort of pushing the cools as we sort of get out into the moonlight. Again, I could have probably pushed a lot of these colors even more. So even in an image like this where, it's sort of pretty complicated, I was able to, push and experiment and play, and you can see I was doing that thing that, I didn't quite have the guts to do, which is, I sort of made this really red behind him. Why? Because he's a pretty mean character, and that kind of makes sense. In a similar way here, really sort of having a bit of color pop, pushing that sort of temperature. Again, not all these things I'm saying are 100% related to warm and cool, but fundamentally the way that you control this is by thinking more in terms of warm and cool rather than in, sort of worrying about what color things are. And just understanding, hey, we got this sort of cool, warm, red, bright panel that's going to sort of jump off the page. And, even though a lot of this is a little bit more muddy, it really kind of makes the page feel more interesting. And even if you just look at it as a spread, right? This is very gray. This page is a little bit, it's falling into that Seven Pirates trap that I was kind of talking about where, yeah, everything's a little bit sort of muddy. I think there's a bit more contrast, but, just having this sort of bright, vibrant color really sort of pushing the warm, cool contrast there sort of helps quite a bit. And, I think as I sort of progressed, I got sort of better and better at doing this kind of thing. And here we got this page as another example. Again, it's a little bit more toned down in the printed version, but yeah, I was still playing around with this basic idea. Let's make the background more blue. Let's increase the temperature contrast here. Again, where I could, right? Let's sort of push the background, the interior spaces versus exterior spaces. Let's make this red. Why? Because now we get like an interesting color pop. I could have made this couch any color, but again, my instinct for just sort of pushing basic warm and cool contrast was really, really useful in this instance. So yeah, I mean, hopefully that kind of makes sense in terms of, how I think you could maybe sort of lean into some of these things. Maybe you can learn from some of the mistakes that I made along the way. Again, I think some of these sort of pages sort of work, but yeah, there's not a lot of real sort of focus. So this is also where comics are a little bit different, because it's not just the sort of each panel, it's the way they kind of look and the way they look as a spread. So as I was kind of saying, right, before, when we have, where is it? Yeah, that's another one. It's kind of got like quite a lot of sort of color contrast there. Right, pushing some of the reds here for no reason creates a lot of drama. But yeah, when we first have him meeting the, where is it? Here we go. So having like a good contrast between these panels and these panels gives the whole thing a lot more interest, right? Again, having this color scheme, like this panel feels a lot more vibrant, and that's simply because we have good warm and cool color contrast. Our eyes are vibrating between the cool colors, the warm colors, again, warm colors, cool colors, and just as a result, the whole thing feels like, oh, there's way more going on. If we sort of go back to some of those panels that were kind of later on where, I just kind of couldn't quite figure out how to, sort of make it and separate some of them out, then yeah, the whole thing just kind of looked a little bit more like, oh, this is all the same. There's not a lot of that sort of focus. So In comics, a lot of it is a matter of viewing each panel as a composition with warm and cool, and also the entire page, and also then the spread as having sort of a good warm and cool contrast. And that's something that, again, another thing that I sort of learned that really sort of helped me when it came to comics. Again, just random red background really sort of helps to brighten up the whole thing. It matches the story. It's just a matter of, again, having the confidence to do that. All right, that's all I've got for this particular video. Hopefully just me going through and talking you through some of my journey has helped you to understand the concept of warm and cool and how it can be applied. Went off on a few little sort of tangents there, so I do apologize, but again, just trying to share with you my experience and my sort of journey, sort of learning more about color. And again, having to teach this stuff has taught me even more about it. Having to explain it has actually made a lot of my art stronger and better. So again, that's a big part of sort of what I do here, trying to sort of, help everyone sort of understand more about color theory. There's a lot that I feel like I could still get better at it. And, that's one of the beauties of art, is it's a journey. You can always get better at these things, and there's always new things you can learn. So anyway, let me know if you've got any color thoughts in the comments down below, whether this has kind of helped you to think through it. Let me know where you're at with your sort of color journey. And again, hopefully this has helped you along the way. Other than that, we'll catch you around. Happy drawing.